A warm breeze moves across the fields of Aberdeen, Mississippi, in the late 1940s, carrying with it the hum of crickets and the faint scent of soil turned over after a long day's work. It is February of 1947, and in a modest wooden home, a child is born, Jeff Fort, the fourth of 10 children to a family struggling but steadfast. His parents, John and Annie Fort, could not have imagined that this small boy, wrapped in worn cotton cloth, would one day command one of the most powerful and feared organizations in the United States. The world around him was slow, rural, and steeped in the rhythm of Southern life, yet destiny was already tugging at him from far beyond the Mississippi Delta. The South in those years was a place divided by invisible lines, of race, of poverty, of opportunity. For the Fort family, life was a constant search for stability, a quest for a place where their children could find safety and possibility. The steel mills and factories of the North promised that kind of future. Like many African American families in the years after World War II, they packed what little they had and joined the Great Migration, heading toward the vast city of Chicago. It was a move that changed everything. The journey northward carried more than bodies, it carried dreams, frustrations, and the quiet hope of reinvention. The Fort settled in the south side of Chicago, in the Woodlawn neighborhood, an area alive with music, laughter, and the echoes of struggle. Apartment blocks stood shoulder to shoulder, children played stickball in the alleys, and preachers called out from church stoops. Yet under this vibrant surface lay tension, the slow burn of poverty, segregation, and street survival. This was the world young Jeff grew up in, a world where opportunity came at a price, and respect had to be earned block by block. The neighborhood itself became a teacher, whispering lessons about power, loyalty, and the delicate balance between fear and admiration. As Jeff learned to navigate those streets, something in his demeanor set him apart. He was small, wiry, but carried an unusual confidence. He could diffuse a fight with a few calm words or ignite one with a glance. People listened when he spoke, even as a boy. Teachers noticed his intelligence, but school could not hold him for long. The chaos of the classroom seemed insignificant compared to the unspoken hierarchy outside, where who you were mattered less than what you could command. By his early teens, Jeff had already started to drift away from formal education, spending more time watching the older boys who ruled the blocks, memorizing their gestures, their slang, their silent codes of survival. The South Side in the 1950s was a city within a city. Gangs were not yet the empires they would become, but they were forming, small groups of neighborhood kids organizing for protection, identity, and territory. Fights were common, but so was the sense of belonging that came with a name, a color, and a cause. It was in this world that Jeff began to find his purpose. The lessons from Aberdeen, the tight-knit sense of family, the understanding of hardship, met the lessons of Chicago's streets, unity means power. Even then, the seeds of something larger were taking root inside him. By the time Jeff reached his early teens, trouble was following him closely. He was caught stealing and sent to a juvenile detention center, the Illinois State Training School for Boys at St. Charles. It was a grim place, cold walls, strict schedules, boys hardened too early. Yet it was here that fate introduced him to Eugene "Bull" Hairston, another young man from the South Side with a spark of leadership in his eyes. The two formed an instant bond, not out of shared mischief but out of mutual vision. They both wanted more than what the streets offered. They wanted control, unity, and respect. Within those confined walls, their conversations drifted toward the idea of building something powerful when they returned home. Something that could defend their people and give them purpose. When Jeff was released and returned to Woodlawn, the city felt different. Civil rights marches were stirring the nation, the Vietnam War was looming, and communities like his were restless, searching for leaders. Jeff saw what others didn't, the potential to organize that restlessness. The boys who once fought each other on corners could become soldiers under one banner. The gang wasn't just a gang, it could be a movement, a force, a family that replaced the one so many had lost in the grind of city life. Still, at this point in the story, no one could imagine the scale of what was to come. The child from Mississippi was growing into something both magnetic and dangerous. His charm could soothe anger, his words could unite rivals, and his mind could plan with a precision far beyond his years. Yet beneath that calm, persuasive voice was a hunger for recognition, an unspoken desire to be seen not merely as a product of the streets, but as a leader, perhaps even a revolutionary. Chicago, with all its noise and neon, became his stage. As night settles over the South Side, you can picture him, a teenager standing beneath a flickering streetlight, hands in his pockets, watching the world with quiet calculation. Around him, the city hums with 1,000 stories of survival, but his story is different. It is the story of a boy who would take the lessons of hardship and twist them into a philosophy of power. A boy who would grow into a man that both uplifted and terrorized his community. A man who would stand at the crossroads of crime, politics, and faith, and try to turn them into one. In this opening chapter of Jeff Fort's life, the rhythm is slow and steady, like the pulse of the city he would one day control. Each experience, the move from Mississippi, the struggles of childhood, the time in juvenile detention, becomes a note in the larger song of his destiny. The listener can almost hear the faint echo of footsteps along Blackstone Avenue, a place that will soon become legendary in its own dark way. And as the night deepens, we begin to sense that the calm before the storm is ending. The stage is set, the actors are in motion, and the story of Jeff Fort, the gangster who tried to become a revolutionary, is only just beginning. The city of Chicago in the 1950s was a restless organism, alive with music, movement, and the hum of survival. The Fort family, freshly settled into the South Side's Woodlawn neighborhood, carried the dreams of the Great Migration in their hearts. The smell of coal smoke mingled with the sweet aroma of bakeries on 63rd Street, while streetcars clattered past rows of brick apartments. For young Jeff Fort, these sounds and scents became the lullaby of his childhood, a blend of promise and peril. The sidewalks were crowded, the voices loud, and beneath every handshake was an unspoken lesson about power and respect. Jeff's parents, John and Annie, worked tirelessly to keep the family afloat. His father picked up jobs wherever he could find them, maintenance, janitorial, hauling. His mother held the household together with quiet strength, feeding 10 children on meager wages and endless resolve. The Fort home was often crowded and noisy, laughter and arguments mixing in equal measure. But outside their door, the neighborhood was changing. Poverty and segregation were tightening their grip, pushing families like the Forts into survival mode. It was a world that demanded toughness, and Jeff was learning that toughness fast. At school, he showed flashes of intelligence that startled teachers. He could memorize things easily, argue his way out of trouble, and charm adults with quick wit. But formal learning never seemed to hold him for long. The textbook spoke of futures that didn't exist for boys like him, not in the Chicago of the 1950s. Every day, when the final bell rang, the real lessons began on the streets: how to read faces, how to avoid trouble, how to earn respect without begging for it. Woodlawn was divided block by block, and identity was forged through those invisible lines. There were local crews, small street groups that watched over their territory, often clashing over pride more than profit. It was in these early years that Jeff began to feel the pull of belonging to something bigger than himself. He was not a large kid, but there was something magnetic about him. Older boys noticed his calm confidence, the way he didn't flinch when things turned tense. He didn't crave violence, but he understood that fear was currency, and he learned how to spend it wisely. Still, beneath the toughness, there was a yearning for control, a quiet understanding that chaos could be turned into order if someone strong enough led the way. The late nights of Woodlawn, with their faint jazz from taverns and the hum of passing cars, shaped that desire. Sometimes he'd sit on the stoop, staring into the glow of streetlights, imagining a future where he wouldn't have to answer to anyone. Maybe, he thought, he could be the one people looked to for direction. But before he could reach that vision, the streets took their toll. Like many young men around him, Jeff drifted toward petty crime. A few stolen items here, a fight there, each step pulling him deeper into the life he once only observed. Eventually, one of those missteps caught up with him. He was arrested and sent to the Illinois State Training School for Boys at St. Charles, a correctional facility notorious for shaping the next generation of Chicago's hardened youth. The walls of St. Charles were thick with stories. Boys came in restless and reckless, and most left colder than when they arrived. For Jeff, it was an education unlike any other. The discipline was harsh, but it was there that he met someone who would change the trajectory of his life, Eugene "Bull" Hairston. Bull was older, broader, and already respected among the inmates, a natural leader with a deep, commanding presence. Where Jeff was quiet and calculating, Bull was loud and charismatic. Together, they formed a bond based on shared vision and mutual understanding. In the long, monotonous days behind those walls, the two boys began to talk about what came next. They spoke of Woodlawn, of their neighborhood swallowed by poverty and neglect, of the kids with no one to guide them. They wondered what would happen if someone gave those lost boys purpose, if the chaos of the streets could be transformed into structure. Their conversations were simple at first, but the idea took root. When they got out, they would organize something powerful, something that could unite the disconnected youth under a single banner. While other boys served their time and forgot, Jeff and Bull planned. They studied how prison hierarchies worked, how respect flowed upward, how leadership depended on loyalty as much as fear. Jeff watched how influence spread quietly, through trust, charisma, and reputation. These were lessons he would carry back to the South Side. When Jeff was finally released, the world outside felt both familiar and strange. The South Side had shifted again. The civil rights movement was stirring, and the streets hummed with anger and hope. Poverty was deepening, but pride was rising too. The city was tense, a boiling pot of energy waiting for direction. Jeff stepped back into that world with a new sense of purpose. He had spent his time inside not just surviving but studying. He knew how to talk to people, how to lead, how to project confidence even when the odds were against him. He began reconnecting with old friends, including Bull Hairston, who had also returned home. Together, they started gathering small groups of neighborhood kids, boys without fathers, without direction, boys who wanted to belong to something. They met in alleys, schoolyards, and church basements, slowly shaping their idea into reality. At first, they called themselves the Blackstone Rangers, named after Blackstone Avenue that ran through their territory. What began as a loose neighborhood crew would soon become the seed of an empire. But those first days were not about power, they were about pride. The young Rangers walked together, defended each other, and projected unity. They wore their colors like armor, symbols of identity in a world that tried to erase them. Jeff, though still barely out of his teens, emerged as the group's natural leader. His calm voice carried authority, his decisions were rarely questioned, and his ability to diffuse conflicts made him both respected and feared. At night, when the city quieted, he'd sit again beneath that same streetlight, this time surrounded by the faint laughter of boys who now followed his lead. He could feel the weight of something forming, something bigger than any of them realized. In his mind, the vision that once flickered faintly was taking shape. He was building a brotherhood, but also, perhaps unknowingly, laying the foundations of a criminal dynasty. The lines between protection and power began to blur, but in those early days, it felt righteous. Jeff saw himself not as a criminal but as a leader of young men failed by the system. He believed, at least for a while, that he could channel the street's energy into purpose. The darkness around him was growing thicker, but he still saw light in it, believing that he could control the storm rather than be consumed by it. The boy who had left Mississippi's quiet nights was now a man of the city, molded by its rhythm, sharpened by its struggle. Each decision, each fight, each alliance was another step on a path he could no longer turn back from. The city had become his classroom, and soon, it would become his kingdom. It began with a handful of boys standing beneath a flickering streetlight on Blackstone Avenue, barely more than kids, yet already hardened by the rhythm of the South Side. The nights were alive with the hum of passing cars, the rattle of L trains, and the muffled laughter that drifted from open apartment windows. In the dim glow, Jeff Fort stood among them, quiet but commanding. He didn't raise his voice often, he didn't have to. There was something in the way he looked at people, steady, unflinching, that made others listen. The streets, once divided by small rivalries and neighborhood grudges, were about to change forever. The idea that had been born in the confines of St. Charles Juvenile Center was coming to life in these alleys. They called themselves the Blackstone Rangers, named after the street that cut through their neighborhood like a main artery. At first, it was nothing grand, just a local group formed for protection, a way for young men to move safely through the city's unpredictable grid of violence. The South Side was a patchwork of small cliques and corner gangs, each fighting for a stretch of pavement, a reputation, or simply a sense of belonging. But under Jeff Fort's guidance, the Rangers quickly became more than a defense group. They became a symbol, a name that carried weight. Jeff's co-founder and close friend, Eugene "Bull" Hairston, provided the energy. He was bold, outgoing, and charismatic, while Jeff remained composed and deliberate. Together, they balanced each other perfectly. Bull could inspire with words, but Jeff could control with silence. It was a duality that made the Blackstone Rangers different from the chaotic crews that came before them. There was organization in their movements, discipline in their behavior, and hierarchy in their ranks. The neighborhood began to notice. The boys who once fought in small, scattered skirmishes now moved together in formation. Their presence brought both security and intimidation. For many residents of Woodlawn, the Rangers were a paradox. They reduced petty street fights but demanded respect and obedience in return. They offered protection, yet their protection came with an unspoken cost: loyalty. Jeff understood psychology better than most men twice his age. He saw how poverty bred desperation, and how desperation could be molded into loyalty if people felt seen and empowered. He gave his followers something no one else had: an identity. The Rangers became a family for the fatherless, a cause for the restless, and a flag for those who had none. Under Jeff's leadership, the group grew rapidly, pulling in boys from other blocks and neighborhoods. By 1962, their name was spreading beyond Woodlawn. Other gangs noticed their unity and the respect they commanded. They began recruiting, expanding, and organizing meetings in community centers, church basements, and schoolyards. The Blackstone Rangers weren't just a gang anymore, they were evolving into something resembling a movement. Jeff's ability to negotiate peace between rival factions gave him a reputation as a mediator. When fights broke out between different groups, he was often the one to step in, talk, and settle disputes. People started calling him the Angel for his calm, almost diplomatic approach. Yet those who truly knew him understood that behind his composure was a strategist's mind, one always calculating, always watching for the next opportunity to grow stronger. As the 1960s unfolded, Chicago itself was changing. The civil rights movement was shaking the nation, and within the city, African American neighborhoods were boiling with both pride and frustration. There were marches, protests, and fiery speeches about equality and empowerment. Jeff Fort watched all of it with careful attention. He saw how political leaders could mobilize people through purpose, and he realized his gang could do the same. The Rangers could be more than a street crew, they could be a force that demanded recognition from both the community and the government. He began adopting some of the language of the movement, words like unity, pride, and strength, but in his world, those ideals took on a different meaning. His kind of unity was enforced, his pride guarded by fear, and his strength came not from speeches, but from control. He wasn't trying to imitate the civil rights leaders, he was building his own kind of power base, one that existed outside their rules. Under his direction, the Rangers started holding meetings that resembled military briefings more than casual gatherings. There were lieutenants, captains, and ranks of soldiers. Initiation rituals were introduced, and hand signs and slogans began to define their identity. Every member was expected to contribute, to follow orders, and to represent the group with pride. The streets around 63rd and Blackstone were soon marked with their symbols, announcing to everyone who ruled the area. But power always draws attention. The Chicago Police Department started taking notice of the sudden rise of this organized group of young men. Community members were torn, some appreciated the way the Rangers kept order, while others feared their growing control. Local newspapers began whispering about a new kind of street organization that might soon rival the established gangs of the city. Jeff paid little mind to the noise, he was already thinking ahead. He began to envision a broader alliance, an organization that could unite not just Woodlawn but the entire South Side. To Jeff, fragmentation was weakness. If all the small gangs could be brought under a single umbrella, they could form a power structure capable of influencing everything from street crime to community programs. It was a vision far ahead of its time, and one that would soon make him both admired and hunted. In these early years, though, there was still a sense of optimism. The boys believed in their leader, believed they were creating something new, something that gave their lives meaning. Jeff's charisma held them together. Even those who doubted his motives couldn't deny his talent for leadership. When he spoke about unity, he sounded convincing. When he promised protection, people believed him. At night, the sound of footsteps echoed through the alleyways, young men in formation, moving silently beneath the city lights. Their presence made residents peek through curtains, both reassured and uneasy. The Rangers were everywhere, guarding corners, settling disputes, and leaving their mark on the walls of abandoned buildings. They were the new order of the South Side. Jeff often walked ahead of them, his mind already years into the future. He could sense that his control over Woodlawn was just the beginning. He dreamed of turning this network of youth into something bigger, something that could command respect not only from the streets but from City Hall, the police, even the federal government. He didn't want to remain a small-time gang leader. He wanted to be recognized as a leader of people, a man who could shape history in his own image. Yet with every step forward, the line between leadership and domination grew thinner. Jeff had tasted authority, and he liked it. The calm, thoughtful boy from Mississippi was becoming a strategist, an organizer, and soon, a ruler. His influence stretched from one end of the South Side to the other, binding together kids who once fought each other with knives and chains. The nights grew longer, the ranks larger, and the name, Blackstone Rangers, began to carry weight beyond Chicago. By the mid-1960s, the seeds of an empire had been planted, an empire that would one day evolve into something far more complex, powerful, and feared. But in these first days, it still felt like a brotherhood, a cause driven by loyalty and belonging. Jeff Fort stood at its center, a quiet figure with sharp eyes and a mind full of plans. The air around him seemed to hum with potential. He had built something from nothing, and it was only the beginning. The streetlight on Blackstone flickered once more, casting long shadows on the pavement. Jeff looked out across the darkened neighborhood, knowing instinctively that the world was changing, and that he would be the one to shape what came next. By the mid-1960s, the Blackstone Rangers had evolved from a loose collection of street youths into one of the most organized and influential groups in Chicago. What had begun as an attempt to create safety and unity among the black youth of Woodlawn had now become a movement that blurred the lines between community activism and organized control. Jeff Fort, standing at the center of it all, had transformed himself from a local gang leader into something resembling a revolutionary commander. He was no longer just reacting to the environment around him, he was shaping it according to his vision. The city, however, was restless. Chicago's South Side had become a battleground of social frustration, racial tension, and political neglect. Housing projects were overcrowded, schools were underfunded, and jobs were scarce. The youth of Woodlawn, Bronzeville, and Englewood grew up surrounded by poverty, police harassment, and systemic exclusion. Against that backdrop, the Blackstone Rangers didn't appear as villains to everyone. To many residents, they were protectors, organizers, and even role models. They gave structure to chaos and offered young men a sense of purpose in a city that had forgotten them. Jeff Fort began to understand the power of perception. He realized that to survive, and to expand, he needed legitimacy. He needed to appear as more than just a gang leader. So, he started to rebrand. Under his direction, the Blackstone Rangers began presenting themselves as a community organization. They held rallies, organized youth programs, and even engaged in cleanup efforts around the neighborhood. Churches and local leaders, desperate for peace, began cautiously collaborating with them. Fort learned to speak the language of progress and empowerment, even as he maintained a firm grip on the streets through intimidation and loyalty. He began attending meetings with community organizers, pastors, and even city officials. His words were calm, measured, and persuasive. He talked about racial unity, about giving young black men opportunities, about taking control of their destiny. Behind that polished rhetoric, though, was the same strategic mind that had built his street empire. Jeff Fort understood politics as another form of power, a new territory to conquer. At the same time, the federal government was launching the war on poverty, channeling funds into community development programs across urban America. Millions of dollars were available to organizations that could claim to help the underprivileged. Jeff saw an opening. He and his lieutenants formed the Grassroots Independent Voters of Illinois, GIVI, a front organization designed to secure government grants for youth development. To many on the outside, it looked like the Blackstone Rangers were reforming, stepping into the realm of civic engagement. In reality, the money flowing in from federal programs became a tool of consolidation. It strengthened Fort's organization, providing resources, meeting spaces, and, most importantly, influence. The Rangers started operating community centers that doubled as recruitment hubs. They held workshops and dances for teenagers, blending social events with subtle indoctrination into the Ranger code of loyalty and unity. To young men who felt invisible in the eyes of the city, this was irresistible. They wore Ranger colors with pride, believing they were part of something powerful and transformative. Jeff Fort had found a way to convert the rage of the streets into organized energy, something that both scared and fascinated outsiders. Yet with every new layer of legitimacy, the scrutiny also deepened. The Chicago Police Department, the FBI, and local politicians began to suspect that Fort's new image as a community leader was merely a disguise. They weren't entirely wrong. Inside the organization, discipline was enforced through fear. Dissenters were silenced, sometimes violently. Fort's word was law, and his inner circle, many of whom had been with him since the early days, ensured that no one challenged his authority. As his power grew, so did his sense of destiny. He began to speak less like a neighborhood boss and more like a prophet. He adopted an almost spiritual tone in his speeches, invoking unity, justice, and divine order. He told his followers that their struggle was bigger than the streets, it was a revolution against a system designed to keep them powerless. He started wearing suits, appearing at meetings with community leaders, and quoting lines about self-determination and liberation. But even as he evolved into a political figure, his methods remained rooted in the streets. He still demanded tribute, still settled disputes through force, and still ruled through loyalty and intimidation. It was around this time that the Rangers caught the attention of national figures. Reporters wrote about them as a new kind of gang, one that mixed militancy with social purpose. Some civil rights activists were conflicted: was Jeff Fort a gangster exploiting the system, or a revolutionary leader rising from the streets? The line between those identities was almost invisible. Jeff's charisma deepened his influence. He could switch tones effortlessly, from charming and articulate when speaking to city officials to commanding and fierce when addressing his soldiers. He understood people's fears and ambitions and used both to his advantage. In meetings with government agencies, he spoke about peace and opportunity. But in private, he reminded his followers that the streets belonged to them, that power was something taken, not given. The federal funding that flowed through GIVI eventually became both a blessing and a curse. While it allowed Fort to expand his organization and gain legitimacy, it also placed him under federal observation. Government officials began tracking where the money went, who it benefited, and whether it truly served the community. When they realized that much of it was reinforcing Fort's control, the scrutiny intensified. The media painted conflicting pictures of him, one as a young black leader trying to uplift his people, and another as a cunning manipulator exploiting the language of social justice for personal gain. Inside the organization, things began to shift. As money and influence grew, so did internal divisions. Some lieutenants wanted to move further into legitimate community work, while others, more loyal to the street code, saw the government money as an opportunity for profit. Fort balanced these tensions with the same calculating calm that had carried him this far. He played factions against each other, ensuring that no single group within the Rangers could become powerful enough to threaten him. Still, there was something almost visionary about his leadership. While most gang leaders sought only immediate power, territory, money, fear, Jeff Fort thought in movements. He wanted something lasting, something that would outlive the fleeting violence of gang wars. He spoke of creating a black nation within a nation, of building institutions, of taking the same discipline they had learned in the streets and applying it to politics, education, and self-defense. By the late 1960s, the Blackstone Rangers had become one of the largest and most structured street organizations in the United States. They had uniforms, headquarters, and alliances with other neighborhood groups. They had transitioned from chaos to order, from street fights to strategic governance. Yet beneath this disciplined exterior, the same undercurrent of violence remained. The organization's unity was built on the same foundation of fear and control that had always defined Jeff Fort's rule. And at the center of it all, Jeff Fort sat in quiet authority, watching, planning, and preparing for the next evolution of his creation. The boy who once commanded a handful of youths beneath a broken streetlight now held sway over thousands. His empire stretched far beyond Woodlawn, reaching into politics, religion, and power itself. The streets whispered his name not just as a gang leader but as something larger, a man who had turned rebellion into revolution. But as Jeff's ambitions grew, so did the forces preparing to confront him. The same institutions that had ignored the South Side for years were now watching closely, unsure whether they were dealing with a visionary reformer or a dangerous insurgent. The answer, perhaps, was both. The late 1960s marked a turning point for both Jeff Fort and the Blackstone Rangers. The organization had matured from a street gang into a formidable social and political entity, and Fort himself was evolving from a local power broker into a figure with national visibility. But with visibility came pressure, from law enforcement, rival gangs, and even from within his own ranks. Beneath the surface of progress and reform, cracks were forming in the foundation Fort had built. The streets that once feared him now also whispered questions about his motives, his power, and his vision. The atmosphere in Chicago's South Side was charged with change. Across the United States, the civil rights movement was transforming into something more militant. Figures like Malcolm X, Stokely Carmichael, and Huey P. Newton had shifted the national conversation from integration to empowerment, from patience to resistance. Jeff Fort watched closely. He was fascinated by the Black Panther Party, by their discipline, their symbolism, and their ability to channel community frustration into organized strength. In their methods, he saw a reflection of his own principles, structure, loyalty, and unity. But unlike the Panthers, Fort's base of power came not from ideology, but from the streets. He began to weave these influences into his own leadership style. Meetings at the Rangers' headquarters became more formalized, almost ceremonial. Members were expected to adhere to a strict code of behavior. Fort introduced new hierarchies, ranks, and rituals that mirrored both military precision and religious devotion. It wasn't just a gang anymore, it was an institution with laws, oaths, and a sense of destiny. His speeches grew longer and more philosophical, laced with ideas about liberation, discipline, and divine purpose. The young men who listened often found themselves entranced by his words. To them, Fort wasn't just a leader, he was a prophet of power, someone who gave meaning to their struggle. At the same time, Fort's relationship with outside institutions became increasingly complex. The government funding that once supported the Rangers' community projects was under review. Reports began circulating that federal grants were being misused, that funds intended for job training and youth outreach were instead bolstering the Rangers' power structure. Investigations followed, and suddenly, the same system that had once courted Fort as a community leader was beginning to turn against him. Journalists swarmed the South Side, eager to uncover the truth behind the enigmatic figure of Jeff Fort. Was he a revolutionary or a criminal? A savior or a manipulator? The headlines reflected the confusion: street gang or youth movement? Chicago's Blackstone Rangers, social force or menace? Fort, ever the strategist, used the attention to his advantage. He granted selective interviews, presenting himself as a misunderstood leader fighting for his people. His calm voice, articulate manner, and sharp intelligence disarmed many of his critics. Even those who doubted him couldn't deny his charisma. But while he played the role of reformer in public, behind closed doors the organization's grip on the community tightened. Extortion, drug dealing, and violence still lingered in the shadows. Rival gangs like the East Side Disciples and the Vice Lords were gaining ground, and the Rangers fought to maintain dominance. Fort knew that power, no matter how idealistic its presentation, required force. His lieutenants enforced discipline through fear. Anyone caught disobeying orders faced severe punishment. Fort's word was not to be questioned. Within the inner circle, tensions were rising. Some older members, who had joined during the early days of the Blackstone Rangers, began to feel uneasy about the growing authoritarianism. They had once believed in Fort's message of community empowerment, but now they saw more control than liberation. Yet, few dared to speak openly. Fort's influence was immense, even a whisper of dissent could result in isolation or worse. As government scrutiny intensified, Fort realized he needed to reinvent himself once again. The name Blackstone Rangers had become too closely associated with crime and controversy. To protect his empire and distance it from its violent past, he initiated a rebranding. In 1969, the organization officially became the Black P. Stone Nation, a title that suggested pride, unity, and rebirth. The P stood for power, symbolizing strength and control. The new name was more than a cosmetic change, it was a statement of identity. It told the world that the movement was evolving beyond the streets, reaching for something greater. Under this new banner, Fort tightened the hierarchy further. He became known as Chief Malik, a title that carried both spiritual and royal undertones. The group adopted Islamic influences, though at first these were more symbolic than doctrinal. Members began using terms like brother and nation, echoing the language of self-determination movements. They saw themselves not just as a gang, but as a sovereign force within their own community, a government within a government. The Black P. Stone Nation became one of the most disciplined organizations in Chicago. They held parades, community events, and rallies, presenting themselves as protectors of the black community. They controlled vast swaths of the South Side and established a reputation for order in neighborhoods plagued by chaos. For a time, even the police found it difficult to penetrate their structure. Every member knew his role, every corner was watched, and every challenge was swiftly handled. Yet, this newfound order came with its own dangers. The organization's power attracted both fear and envy. Rival gangs began forming alliances to counter the Stones' dominance. Shootings and turf wars erupted, threatening the image of unity Fort had worked so hard to project. Meanwhile, federal agents continued their investigations. They monitored Fort's finances, his associates, and even his personal meetings. It became clear that he was under constant surveillance. Jeff Fort, however, remained calm. To those closest to him, he often spoke about inevitability. They fear what they don't control, he would say, his voice steady. And they can't control what they don't understand. He believed he was playing a long game, one that stretched beyond the reach of police or politics. He saw himself as part of a historical struggle, not just for power, but for recognition. In the evenings, he would sometimes sit by the window of his office overlooking the neighborhood. The city lights flickered across the rooftops, the hum of distant traffic blending with the sounds of the streets below. To him, it wasn't just noise, it was music, the rhythm of a world he had helped shape. The people outside lived by his rules, followed his symbols, and echoed his language. He had built an empire out of discontent, transforming the chaos of poverty into something structured and feared. But even as Jeff Fort looked out over his domain, a quiet tension was beginning to form, a tension between his dream of legitimacy and the reality of the life he led. The more he reached for respectability, the more his past clung to him. The city, the government, and even his own people were beginning to question whether the transformation was real or just another mask. By the close of the decade, Jeff Fort stood at a crossroads. He had created one of the most powerful street organizations in America, but it came at a price. The system that had once funded his rise now saw him as a threat. The police saw a criminal mastermind. The community saw both a protector and a tyrant. And Fort himself began to see the limits of his control. In the coming years, his ambition would lead him to seek a new kind of power, one that blended faith, politics, and defiance. But for now, as the 1960s faded into memory, Jeff Fort's reign over Chicago's South Side seemed untouchable. What he didn't know was that the next phase of his journey would test everything he had built, and begin his transformation from gangster to revolutionary. By the dawn of the 1970s, Jeff Fort had become a paradox, both feared and admired, both criminal and visionary. His organization, now known as the Black P. Stone Nation, stood as one of the most formidable street entities in the United States. To many within Chicago's South Side, the Stones represented strength and protection in a city that had long neglected them. But to the authorities, Fort's growing empire looked less like a community movement and more like an insurgency taking shape within American borders. The seeds of revolution were being sown, though not in the way anyone could have predicted. The rebranding of the Blackstone Rangers into the Black P. Stone Nation had changed everything. The word nation carried weight, it suggested structure, sovereignty, and purpose. Members no longer saw themselves merely as gangsters, they were citizens of a self-contained state with its own laws, hierarchy, and ruler. Jeff Fort, now calling himself Chief Malik, was both leader and spiritual guide, a man whose commands blended military discipline with religious devotion. He began holding meetings that resembled council gatherings more than street sessions, complete with recitations, pledges, and discussions about the future of their nation. Fort's embrace of Islamic terminology and symbolism was strategic as much as it was philosophical. During this period, the teachings of Islam, particularly those of the Nation of Islam, were spreading through America's black communities. The message of discipline, pride, and self-sufficiency resonated deeply with the disillusioned youth of Chicago. Fort recognized its power. He began incorporating Islamic greetings and phrases into his daily language. Members addressed him as Brother Chief Malik and referred to themselves as the Nation. Though Fort was not yet fully religious in conviction, he understood that this new identity offered more than just legitimacy, it offered unity under a divine cause. Inside the organization, life was changing. Uniforms became standard. Meetings were opened with prayers. The younger members were taught not just loyalty but ideology, the idea that they were part of something sacred and unstoppable. The concept of stone love emerged, a mix of brotherhood and obedience that bound the group in near-religious devotion. They had codes for discipline, ethics, and conflict resolution. On the surface, it looked like transformation. Beneath, however, it remained a tightly controlled system that enforced obedience through fear and punishment. Meanwhile, law enforcement agencies were growing increasingly alarmed. The Chicago Police Department, backed by the FBI, began intensifying surveillance. The CNTLPRO program, an FBI initiative aimed at monitoring and disrupting black nationalist and revolutionary movements, had already targeted figures like Martin Luther King Jr. and the Black Panthers. Now, Jeff Fort's name began to appear in their files. To the federal government, his organization represented a dangerous convergence of two forces, organized crime and black militancy. The potential for violence was too great to ignore. Reports began circulating that the Black Stone Nation was stockpiling weapons, training members, and enforcing strict control over entire neighborhoods. Whether these reports were exaggerated or not, they fueled growing paranoia among city officials. Fort's every move was tracked, his phone calls tapped, his meetings photographed, his finances investigated. Agents began infiltrating his organization, posing as sympathizers or community workers. But Fort was a cautious man. He spoke in codes, often changing meeting locations without notice. He seemed to anticipate every move, staying one step ahead of the authorities. Still, cracks were beginning to show. The immense size of the organization made it difficult to maintain absolute control. Factions within the nation began forming, some loyal to Fort's vision of transformation and others more focused on money and territory. Drug trafficking, extortion, and violence remained part of daily operations, undermining the image of legitimacy Fort tried so hard to build. Rival gangs saw opportunities in this fragmentation, reigniting conflicts across the South Side. Amid the chaos, Fort continued to project an image of serenity and command. He began speaking more about destiny, about divine purpose, and about the oppression of Black people in America. To his followers, his words carried a messianic tone. He told them they were chosen to build something eternal, a nation within a nation, where no one could dictate their fate. His charisma was magnetic, his confidence unshakable. When he spoke, even the most hardened street soldiers listened in reverent silence. One of Fort's greatest talents was his ability to adapt. As government pressure mounted and funding dried up, he shifted focus from public community programs to private control. The Black Stone Nation became less about public visibility and more about internal cohesion. Members swore oaths of secrecy and loyalty. Fort began to surround himself with a smaller circle of trusted lieutenants, men who shared his belief in discipline and divine order. He distanced himself from day-to-day street activities, preferring to operate from a position of symbolic leadership. In many ways, he became more like a political figure than a gang boss. Despite his efforts, the media continued to portray him as a criminal mastermind. The duality of his existence fascinated the public, a man who preached peace and brotherhood while commanding one of the most feared gangs in America. Some journalists even referred to him as the Street Messiah of Chicago, a title that captured both his mystique and his contradictions. Fort, for his part, didn't mind the label. He believed it reinforced his legend, making him both untouchable and inevitable. As his influence expanded, Fort began establishing connections beyond Chicago. Rumors spread of alliances with other urban groups across the Midwest and even with revolutionary organizations like the Black Panther Party. Whether or not these alliances were formal, the symbolism was powerful. Jeff Fort was no longer just a local figure, he was becoming part of a broader narrative of Black empowerment, resistance, and self-governance. But the federal government was determined to dismantle that narrative. In 1972, after years of investigation, authorities moved in. Fort was indicted on charges related to misappropriation of government funds from the earlier Givey program. Though the charges were not directly related to violent crimes, they were enough to pull him into the legal system. The trial was long and heavily publicized. Prosecutors painted Fort as a manipulator who had exploited social programs for personal gain. His lawyers, on the other hand, argued that he was a community leader targeted for his influence over young Black men. In the courtroom, Fort remained calm and dignified. Dressed in a suit, he spoke respectfully but firmly, often correcting prosecutors when they mispronounced the names of his associates or misrepresented his intentions. To those watching, he appeared composed, even regal. But beneath the surface, the weight of the system was closing in. When the verdict came, Fort was convicted and sentenced to prison. For many, it seemed like the end of his reign, the inevitable fall of a man who had risen too high. Yet, for Jeff Fort, prison was not defeat. It was transformation. He viewed his incarceration not as punishment but as a test, a chance to refine his identity and deepen his spiritual resolve. Behind bars, he began to immerse himself in religious study, particularly in Islam. The teachings he had once borrowed for symbolism now became central to his existence. The walls of confinement, instead of breaking him, gave him focus. In the solitude of his cell, he began to envision a new chapter for himself and his nation, one that would blend faith, discipline, and rebellion into something the world had never seen before. Outside, his followers remained loyal. They spoke of Chief Malik in reverent tones, treating his imprisonment as exile rather than downfall. His legend only grew. The man who had once ruled the streets of Chicago was now seen as a spiritual leader, a prophet in waiting. And as he sat alone in his cell, planning, reflecting, and praying, Jeff Fort began preparing for his rebirth, the moment when the gangster would give way to the revolutionary. The transformation was coming. The world just didn't know it yet. Prison changed Jeff Fort, but not in the way the authorities had hoped. They had imagined his incarceration as the breaking of a king, a way to dissolve the power of the Black Pete, Stone Nation by removing its leader from the streets. Instead, what began in a cold concrete cell would become the next evolution of Fort's legend. Isolation stripped him of the noise of the outside world, forcing him inward, where ambition met reflection. For the first time, Jeff Fort had the silence to think not just about survival, but about destiny. In the prison system of the early 1970s, Fort found himself surrounded by men who had been crushed by society, black men from the same streets he had once ruled, victims of poverty, systemic racism, and violence. But he also encountered something else, the rise of a new consciousness. Inmates were turning toward education, spirituality, and radical political study. The teachings of the Nation of Islam spread through prison blocks like wildfire, offering structure and dignity in a place built to dehumanize. For a man already obsessed with discipline and order, this ideology resonated deeply. Fort began reading voraciously. He devoured the Quran, the works of Malcolm X, and revolutionary writings from across the Black liberation movement. The more he read, the more he felt that his life had been leading towards something greater. He started to see his years as a gang leader not as a series of crimes, but as preparation, training for a new kind of leadership. Where before he had ruled through fear and control, now he dreamed of ruling through faith and purpose. He began holding informal study sessions with other inmates, sharing his interpretations of scripture and philosophy. These meetings weren't mere discussions, they were sermons. His words carried the same hypnotic rhythm that had once commanded thousands on the streets. In the sterile silence of the prison chapel, men would sit transfixed as Fort spoke about unity, divine justice, and self-liberation. He told them they were soldiers in a spiritual war, and that their time behind bars was a test of strength. The transformation wasn't instantaneous. Fort's ego remained intact, his sense of destiny unbroken. But over time, the gangster's bravado softened into the calm authority of a preacher. He began adopting the practices of Islam with sincerity, fasting, praying, and studying Arabic. He corresponded with religious scholars and wrote letters to followers on the outside, encouraging them to hold strong. He urged the Black Pete, Stone Nation to maintain discipline and unity, warning them that without order, the organization would fall into chaos. Outside the prison walls, his followers clung to his words as if they were scripture. They passed around his letters, read them aloud at meetings, and continued referring to him as Chief Malik. The nation persisted, smaller, fragmented, but still alive. Fort's absence had elevated him from leader to legend. His name became more powerful in confinement than it had been in freedom. Inside, Fort's reputation grew among the inmates. He became known as a man of wisdom and control, a mediator, a teacher, and a strategist. Guards noted his influence and began treating him with cautious respect. He was no longer just an inmate, he was a symbol. Other prisoners sought his counsel on disputes, personal struggles, and faith. Fort listened patiently, speaking softly, always measured in tone. There was something magnetic about the way he carried himself, composed, deliberate, and unyielding. But even as his spirituality deepened, the instinct for power never left him. Fort believed that God had chosen him for a purpose beyond ordinary comprehension. He began to merge his spiritual awakening with his old strategic mindset. To him, faith was not a retreat from power, it was its highest form. In his mind, he was no longer just a gang leader or even a community figure, he was a messenger, a vessel of divine will destined to reshape the black struggle in America. He developed a new philosophy that fused Islam with his own code of loyalty and discipline. He wrote about creating a divine nation, one that would rise above both criminality and oppression. His vision was not merely religious, it was structural. He wanted to build a movement that could sustain itself economically, politically, and spiritually. In his writings, he referred to it as a kingdom of order, where faith would replace violence and purpose would replace despair. This evolution caught the attention of prison officials and intelligence agencies alike. Reports described Fort as a potentially radicalizing influence among inmates. His ability to command respect and unity even behind bars alarmed authorities, who feared he might transform the prison system into a breeding ground for organized resistance. Yet, despite their efforts to isolate him, Fort's influence continued to spread. Transfers to other facilities did little to silence him, wherever he went, his charisma followed. Meanwhile, on the outside, the streets were changing. The early 1970s saw a shift in the drug trade, with heroin flooding Chicago's neighborhoods. The younger generation of gang members, disconnected from Fort's discipline, turned to profit over purpose. Violence surged, and the sense of unity he had once instilled began to unravel. Older members of the Black P. Stone Nation tried to maintain order, invoking his teachings, but without Fort's presence, the structure weakened. Rival gangs grew bolder, territories shifted, and the empire he had built began to fracture. Still, even in disarray, the legend of Jeff Fort loomed large. His name was spoken with reverence and fear, like a ghost that haunted every decision. Rumors spread that he was communicating secret orders from prison, guiding operations from afar. Whether or not that was true didn't matter, the belief alone was enough to keep loyalty alive. In prison, Fort began preparing for his eventual release. He studied leadership, history, and international politics. He learned about revolutions in Africa and the Middle East, drawing parallels between their struggles and those of Black Americans. The stories of liberation movements in Libya, Egypt, and Algeria fascinated him. He admired how leaders like Muammar Gaddafi used ideology, religion, and symbolism to unite people under a single banner. The idea of blending political resistance with divine authority resonated deeply within him. By the time Fort's sentence neared its end, he was no longer the man who had entered prison years before. He emerged with a new identity, still Chief Malik, but now with a spiritual mantle. To his followers, his release was not just a return, it was a resurrection. The message spread quickly through Chicago's South Side, the chief was coming home. And when he did, it would not be as a gangster seeking control of the streets. It would be as a leader ready to declare a new mission, a fusion of religion, revolution, and redemption. His time behind bars had refined him, tempered his instincts, and deepened his resolve. But what the world didn't realize was that this transformation would also set him on a collision course with forces far greater than any rival gang or city official. Jeff Fort's next chapter would blur the boundaries between faith and extremism, between leadership and fanaticism. And once again, the streets of Chicago, and the eyes of the nation, would turn toward the man who refused to be forgotten. When Jeff Fort returned from prison in the mid-1970s, he emerged transformed. Gone was the flamboyant street general who had once ruled the South Side through fear and loyalty. In his place stood a man who carried himself with a sense of divine purpose, a prophet in tailored suits, whose every word was measured like scripture. The years behind bars had not broken him, they had refined him. He had studied religion, politics, and global revolution. He had absorbed the philosophies of the Nation of Islam, the tactics of African liberation movements, and the rhetoric of anti-imperialist leaders from across the world. Fort no longer saw himself as just a gang leader, he saw himself as the architect of a spiritual nation. Upon his release, he wasted no time rebuilding what had been lost. The Black Stone Nation was fragmented, divided by the chaos that had overtaken Chicago's gang landscape in his absence. Younger members were involved in drug trafficking and street violence that had no direction or code. To Fort, this was blasphemy. He believed that the nation's power was sacred, a divine gift meant for higher purpose, not self-destruction. His first mission was to restore discipline. He began calling meetings, summoning old lieutenants, and speaking to crowds of young followers with the same fire that had once built an empire from the streets. But this time, his message was different. He spoke less of money and territory and more of faith, purity, and unity under God. He began to refer to himself as Imam Malik, the spiritual leader of a reborn movement. He taught that the black community had been enslaved not only by systemic racism but by moral decay. Drugs, greed, and betrayal were tools of the oppressor, he said, designed to destroy black power from within. To reclaim their strength, they needed to rise above the material world and embrace divine discipline. Fort officially renamed his organization Rukn, an Arabic term meaning the foundation, or the pillar. It symbolized his vision for a divine nation rooted in faith and order. The headquarters was moved into an old stone building at 3947 South Drexel Boulevard, which Fort called the Temple. What had once been a gang headquarters was now transformed into a place of worship, strategy, and ceremony. Members prayed 5 times a day, followed Islamic rituals, and referred to Fort as both their spiritual and political leader. Inside the temple, Fort established a system that mirrored both a religious order and a military command. There were ranks, uniforms, and oaths of loyalty. Members addressed each other with Arabic titles and swore allegiance not to a criminal enterprise, but to what Fort described as a divine cause. He combined Islamic imagery with the same street discipline that had once made his gang formidable. His lieutenants became ministers, his soldiers became mujahideen, and his followers were taught that they were warriors in a holy struggle for liberation. The Rukn movement attracted attention quickly. For many in the black community, it was a source of pride and identity. Fort's rhetoric about self-sufficiency, unity, and divine order resonated with those disillusioned by the failures of civil rights reform and the rise of drugs in their neighborhoods. He preached that the black man must reclaim his destiny through faith and discipline, not dependence on a system designed to keep him broken. His followers patrolled neighborhoods, ran food programs, and tried to keep drugs out of certain blocks. For a time, it seemed as if Fort had truly transcended his past and created something revolutionary. But beneath the spiritual surface, the shadows of his old empire lingered. Law enforcement agencies viewed Rukn not as a religious organization but as a sophisticated criminal syndicate wearing a new mask. The FBI, Chicago police, and federal intelligence units began monitoring Fort's activities closely. They suspected that his talk of spiritual warfare was a cover for a more worldly agenda, one that involved power, money, and influence. Reports indicated that while the temple preached purity, some members were still deeply involved in the drug trade. Fort himself became more secretive, more paranoid. He began surrounding himself with a small inner circle of trusted lieutenants and converted followers, creating an almost cult-like atmosphere. Inside the temple, his word was absolute. He spoke of divine visions, of being chosen by God to lead his people to freedom. To challenge him was to defy not just the chief, but God's will. Those who questioned his authority were either exiled from the group or silenced. His charisma had evolved into something more dangerous, a form of spiritual dominance that blurred the line between faith and control. As his influence grew, Fort sought to connect Rukn to broader revolutionary movements. He reached out to Islamic organizations and political groups across the country, presenting himself as a spiritual leader fighting for black liberation under divine law. He began studying international politics with new intensity, fascinated by the global rise of Islam as both a religious and political force. He saw in the Middle East a model of defiance against Western domination, a mirror of what he wanted to build in America's ghettos. In the late 1970s, Fort and Rukn started adopting increasingly militant rhetoric. They talked of building alliances with other Islamic nations, of forming a black Islamic state within America. Fort's transformation from gang leader to revolutionary mystic was nearly complete. He was no longer content to control a neighborhood, he wanted to control the narrative of black identity itself. To him, the ghettos of Chicago were not just battlegrounds, they were sacred grounds, the first territory of a coming divine revolution. Yet even as he spoke of peace, redemption, and faith, the forces surrounding him were closing in. Federal agents were compiling intelligence, local police were infiltrating his organization, and informants whispered of drug deals, weapons caches, and secret meetings. The line between religion and rebellion was vanishing fast, and Jeff Fort seemed to be walking directly into the fire. He had built the temple as a sanctuary of divine purpose, but it was also becoming a fortress, a symbol of power that both inspired the oppressed and terrified the authorities. To his followers, he was a prophet. To his enemies, he was a warlord cloaked in religious robes. And to Jeff Fort himself, he was simply fulfilling his destiny, a man chosen by fate and faith to rise against a world that had always tried to cage him. But destiny has a price, and soon, the world would test just how far Fort's faith, and his empire, could truly endure. By the early 1980s, Jeff Fort's transformation into Imam Malik, the spiritual head of Rukn, had reached its height. To the outside world, his organization appeared to be a religious movement, deeply disciplined and rooted in Islamic teachings. Yet beneath the surface, the line between faith and criminal enterprise had all but vanished. Fort preached of divine order, but behind closed doors, he orchestrated a network that moved drugs, collected extortion payments, and enforced loyalty through fear and spiritual manipulation. The temple on Drexel Boulevard, once a beacon of community unity, was becoming something darker, a fortress of faith and fire. Inside the temple, everything revolved around Fort. His followers regarded him not merely as a man, but as a divine messenger chosen to lead them into a new era. He dressed in flowing robes, held daily prayer gatherings, and delivered sermons that mixed scripture with strategy. His words carried the calm rhythm of a preacher, yet beneath that soothing cadence was the hard edge of a general commanding soldiers. To outsiders, his speeches sounded like calls for moral reform. But to his inner circle, they were coded instructions, plans for expanding influence, collecting dues, and defending their territory. Fort's control over Rukn was absolute. The organization had its own system of governance, titles like ministers, ambassadors, and commanders were used to describe roles that were both religious and operational. Every decision, from street-level disputes to financial transactions, had to be approved by him. Even the language of the gang had changed. Members used Arabic phrases and called their neighborhood the Holy City. In the eyes of the faithful, the South Side of Chicago was not just a collection of blocks, it was sacred ground blessed by divine authority. But the illusion of holiness could not hide the violence. Rukn still operated as a powerful street organization, controlling the drug trade across much of the South Side. Fort's doctrine of spiritual discipline was now enforced through fear. Members who disobeyed orders or challenged leadership were punished severely. Some disappeared, others were excommunicated publicly. Inside the temple's stone walls, loyalty was absolute, and betrayal was considered not just treason, but blasphemy. The Chicago Police Department and the FBI had long been watching Fort's transformation. To them, Rukn was nothing more than the Black Stone Nation reborn under a new name. Federal agents began building detailed intelligence files, recording the group's connections to drug traffickers, political figures, and even international contacts. Surveillance teams parked in unmarked cars near the temple, taking photos of visitors and tracking shipments moving through the city. What they uncovered would eventually shock the nation, but for now, the authorities waited, patiently gathering evidence while Fort expanded his reach. Inside the community, opinions about Rukn were divided. Some residents still saw Fort as a visionary, a man who had cleaned up parts of Woodlawn and given young men a sense of belonging and pride. They admired his call for self-discipline, his programs for food distribution, and his rhetoric about black unity. But others whispered about the darker side of his empire. They spoke of drug deals conducted under the guise of prayer meetings, of armed men guarding the temple's perimeter, of mysterious meetings with figures from other cities. The aura of spirituality was cracking, revealing a web of corruption and control underneath. As Fort's influence grew, so did his sense of destiny. He began to see himself not just as the leader of a local movement, but as a global revolutionary. He studied the speeches of Muammar Gaddafi, admired the defiance of Middle Eastern leaders who stood against the United States, and envisioned himself as part of a worldwide Islamic awakening. To Fort, the struggle of Chicago's ghettos mirrored the struggles of oppressed nations abroad. The enemy was the same, an unjust system that sought to suppress black and Muslim power. In this belief, Fort found new purpose. He began sending emissaries to meet with international representatives, claiming that Rukn was part of a larger global front against oppression. Some of his followers even began adopting military-style formations, calling themselves soldiers of God. The temple became both a place of worship and a command center for what Fort saw as a new world order. But the deeper Fort sank into his vision of divine revolution, the more detached from reality he became. He surrounded himself with loyalists who reinforced his beliefs, filtering out any dissent. He rarely left the temple, communicating through intermediaries and coded messages. Visitors described an atmosphere that felt almost cult-like, devotees moving silently, guards stationed at every door, and Fort himself seated on a raised platform, speaking softly as his followers hung on every word. The spiritual peace he claimed to offer had transformed into a suffocating hierarchy of obedience. At night, the temple glowed faintly from within, its stained-glass windows flickering with candlelight. Outside, the streets were quiet, but tension filled the air. Residents knew that the building was no longer just a place of prayer, it was the headquarters of a man whose power stretched across neighborhoods and minds alike. Some feared him. Others revered him. Many simply tried to stay out of his way. Still, Fort remained calm, composed, and certain of his purpose. He believed history would vindicate him, that one day, the world would recognize him not as a gangster, but as a prophet who rose from the ashes of poverty to guide his people. Yet the forces gathering beyond his walls, federal agents, rival gangs, political enemies, were preparing to challenge that vision. The contradictions in his empire were beginning to collapse in on themselves. Rukn had become something that defied easy definition, part religion, part revolution, part criminal organization. To Jeff Fort, it was the embodiment of his faith and power. To law enforcement, it was a ticking bomb waiting to explode. And as whispers began to circulate of foreign money, weapons deals, and secret allegiances, one thing became certain: Jeff Fort's world was heading toward a collision between heaven and earth. The temple stood silent under the Chicago night, but within its walls, plans were being made that would soon draw the attention of the entire world. What began as a dream of redemption was now teetering on the edge of conspiracy. And in the shadows of Drexel Boulevard, Jeff Fort's path was leading him toward the most dangerous alliance of his life, one that would forever seal his fate. By 1983, the lines between religion, politics, and crime had blurred so completely within Jeff Fort's world that even his most loyal followers could no longer tell where one ended and the other began. Inside the massive stone building on Drexel Boulevard, the temple, something larger and far more dangerous was brewing. To outsiders, Rukn appeared as a faith-based community organization led by a man of divine conviction. But behind those fortress walls, Jeff Fort had begun orchestrating a plan that reached beyond the streets of Chicago and into the turbulent politics of the Middle East. At this point, Fort's influence stretched across state lines. His word carried power in prisons, on street corners, and in political conversations that most gang leaders could never access. To the young men of Chicago's South Side, he was more than a symbol, he was a savior who had risen from the same poverty they endured. To Fort himself, this adoration confirmed what he already believed, that he had been chosen for a mission greater than any mortal ambition. He began referring to himself as a messenger of divine justice, one whose responsibility was to protect his people by any means necessary. It was in this mindset that Fort's attention turned toward international alliances. The early 1980s were a time of chaos in the Middle East. Libya, under Colonel Muammar Gaddafi, was at odds with the United States and actively supporting revolutionary movements around the world. To Gaddafi, exporting his anti-imperialist ideology was both political and spiritual warfare. And to Jet Fort, this presented an opportunity, a chance to align himself with a world power that shared his defiance of Western systems. Through a series of intermediaries, Fort established contact with Libyan representatives. What began as a diplomatic curiosity soon evolved into something far more serious. The Libyans saw potential in Fort and his Rukn organization. They viewed his army of loyal followers as a possible extension of their revolutionary influence in the U.S., a force that could disrupt or retaliate against American interests if necessary. Fort, in turn, saw Libya as validation of his own spiritual vision. To him, the connection was not about money or weapons, it was destiny. Meetings were arranged in secret. Envoys from Libya met with Rukn members under the guise of cultural and religious exchanges. Conversations flowed about shared faith, shared struggle, and shared enemies. Fort's inner circle began to see themselves as part of a global brotherhood of oppressed Muslims fighting against the Western world. It was intoxicating, the idea that the Rukn nation of Chicago could become an international revolutionary force, recognized by leaders halfway across the world. But beneath the rhetoric of liberation, darker motives took shape. The Libyan agents were not simply interested in spiritual kinship, they were exploring potential acts of terrorism within the United States. They wanted to recruit operatives capable of carrying out attacks if conflict between Libya and America escalated. And Fort, believing he was securing divine alliances, began entertaining these discussions. Whether through naivety, arrogance, or faith, he allowed his movement to walk directly into a trap. The FBI and federal intelligence agencies had been monitoring Rukn for years, but now, the stakes were higher. Rumors of foreign contact, weapons deals, and coded messages flowing from the temple began to reach Washington. Fort's communications were intercepted, and his meetings quietly surveilled. What the investigators uncovered shocked them, a domestic street organization allegedly negotiating with a foreign government labeled by the U.S. as a state sponsor of terrorism. It was something unprecedented. Meanwhile, within the temple, the atmosphere grew increasingly intense. Fort demanded greater devotion from his followers. He ordered fasting periods, daily prayers, and long sermons that blurred scripture with militaristic rhetoric. He warned of an impending war, spiritual and political, that would soon erupt between the righteous and the corrupt. His followers, many of them young men seeking purpose, believed him without question. They trained, studied, and waited for his command. But not everyone was convinced. A few long-time members began to sense that something was off. The teachings that had once inspired them to uplift their community were now being used to justify violence. Fort's obsession with divine destiny was pushing the organization toward self-destruction. Those who raised concerns were silenced or cast out. His circle grew smaller, more paranoid, and more dangerous. The temple no longer felt like a sanctuary, it felt like a bunker preparing for war. Late-night meetings became common. The room would be dimly lit, incense smoke curling through the air as Fort sat at the head of the table, his eyes heavy but alert. Maps, coded letters, and foreign documents were spread before him. His trusted lieutenants listened quietly as he spoke of alliances, of revolution, of striking back at the system that had oppressed their people for generations. To them, he was not just a man plotting politics, he was a prophet planning deliverance. Unbeknownst to Fort, federal agents were already infiltrating his ranks. Informants posing as loyal members were recording conversations and gathering evidence. Every whispered mention of Libya, every coded phrase about operations, was being documented. The authorities were preparing for something larger than a drug raid. They were preparing for a counter-terrorism case that would make history. In 1984, the tension reached a breaking point. Federal investigators had collected enough intelligence to begin building an indictment. They had evidence suggesting that Fort, through intermediaries, had accepted money from Libyan representatives in exchange for promises to carry out acts of violence against U.S. targets. The amount was small compared to global politics, tens of thousands of dollars, but symbolically, it was enormous. For the first time, an American street gang was being accused of forming an alliance with a foreign government against its own country. Inside the temple, Fort remained unaware of how much danger surrounded him. He believed the government was afraid of his spiritual message, not his supposed crimes. In his mind, the surveillance and raids were signs of persecution, proof that his divine mission was real. But the walls were closing in. Federal agents were tightening their net, and former allies were turning into witnesses. The once golden connection with Libya had become a curse, a thread that would unravel everything he had built. As 1985 approached, the Rukn headquarters still buzzed with ritual and rhetoric. Members prayed, trained, and chanted under the flickering lights of the temple, convinced that history was on their side. But outside, in the silent parking lots where unmarked cars watched from the shadows, another kind of faith was being tested, the faith of the law in its pursuit of justice. Jeff Fort had always believed he was chosen to lead his people to freedom. He had once turned a gang into a movement and a street corner into a sanctuary. But now, he had crossed into a realm of geopolitics and espionage he could not control. The story of Jeff Fort and the Libyan connection was no longer just about the streets of Chicago, it was about a man who believed he could stand shoulder to shoulder with world leaders and found himself instead standing at the edge of betrayal. And as the night deepened over the south side, the temple's stone walls seemed to hold their breath. Something monumental was coming, a reckoning that would blur the line between faith and treason forever. The mid-1980s marked the beginning of the end for Jeff Fort, though he didn't yet see it. Inside the high walls of the temple, he still saw himself as a chosen figure, an anointed leader carrying out divine instructions. But beyond those walls, the world was tightening around him. Federal agents had spent years building a meticulous case, and what they now held in their hands was explosive, proof that an American gang leader had aligned himself with a foreign government to commit acts of terrorism. It all began to unfold quietly, almost invisibly. The FBI, working with the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms, ATF, and local law enforcement, had gathered hundreds of hours of surveillance tapes, intercepted calls, and the testimonies of informants from inside Rukn. These tapes revealed discussions about Libya, about money, weapons, and operations that could target American interests if commanded. To the authorities, this wasn't simply gang activity, it was a national security threat. Meanwhile, within Rukn, paranoia had reached new heights. Jeff Fort's leadership style had transformed into total control. Every decision passed through him. Every conversation was monitored. Followers whispered about divine missions, coded prophecies, and enemies plotting against them. Fort often delivered sermons late into the night, his words a mix of scripture, politics, and apocalyptic warning. He told his people that the government feared their spiritual strength and that they were living proof that oppressed people could rise above their captors. But his message was increasingly infused with fear and delusion. As investigators prepared their final moves, cracks within Rukn began to appear. Some members, exhausted by years of blind devotion and constant danger, began questioning their loyalty. The organization's finances were strained, internal disputes were rising, and the constant police pressure was wearing everyone down. In private, some whispered that Fort had gone too far, that the spiritual revolution had turned into a trap from which none could escape. Then came the breaking point. In early 1986, federal prosecutors unveiled their charges. The case was staggering. Jeff Fort and several top Rukn members were accused of conspiring with the Libyan government to carry out acts of terrorism on U.S. soil. The government alleged that Fort had agreed to perform attacks in exchange for money, too. 5 million offered by Libyan agents, though only a small portion of that ever changed hands. The accusations included potential plans to bomb federal buildings, airplanes, and government targets. It was a case unlike any the justice system had ever seen. The headlines exploded. Newspapers across the country ran stories about the gang that tried to become a terrorist organization. Overnight, Jeff Fort was transformed in the public eye from a neighborhood warlord to an international threat. Television crews camped outside the temple, capturing the image of its stone walls and barred windows, once symbols of community unity, now portrayed as the fortress of a domestic enemy. For the federal government, the case was both shocking and politically useful. It reinforced the growing national fear of terrorism in the post-Cold War world. Fort, for his part, denied everything. Through intermediaries, he insisted that the Rukn was a religious and community organization dedicated to peace. He claimed that the government had twisted his words and misunderstood his intent. The Libyan connection, he said, was purely spiritual and educational, not criminal. But behind his calm denials, he knew the truth was more complicated. He had indeed communicated with Libyan agents. He had spoken of alliances, of revolution, of power. Whether he intended violence or not, those words were now being used to destroy him. The temple was raided in a massive show of force. Agents in black uniforms, armed and alert, stormed the building at dawn. Inside, they found caches of weapons, stacks of documents, and evidence of the gang's criminal operations. The press filmed every moment, broadcasting the fall of Rukn to millions of homes across America. For the community, it was a surreal moment. The man who had once preached unity and discipline was now being portrayed as a terrorist leader. The streets that once whispered his name with reverence now echoed with disbelief. Fort was arrested and taken into federal custody. Even as he sat in handcuffs, he projected calm authority. When reporters shouted questions at him, he offered no answers, only a faint smile and a distant look, as if he already knew this was part of a greater prophecy. To his followers, his arrest was seen as martyrdom. They believed he was being punished not for crimes, but for standing up to an unjust system. To his enemies, it was justice long overdue. In the months that followed, the federal case expanded. Former members of Rukn turned state witnesses in exchange for leniency, revealing the inner workings of Fort's organization. They described how money from drug trafficking had funded their operations, how spiritual doctrine was used to enforce obedience, and how discussions about Libya were treated like sacred secrets. Their testimonies painted a portrait of a man who had fused religion, power, and crime into a single empire, a prophet who had lost himself in the very mythology he created. The prosecution built its case meticulously. They presented recordings of conversations in which Fort allegedly discussed acts of sabotage and retaliation. They brought forward Libyan intermediaries and intelligence experts who connected the dots between Fort's organization and foreign agents. The defense argued that the government had overreached, that they were persecuting a black Muslim leader under the guise of national security. The courtroom became a stage where two Americas clashed, one that saw Fort as a dangerous criminal, and one that saw him as a symbol of resistance. But no matter how passionately his defense argued, the evidence was overwhelming. The tapes, the witnesses, the money trails, all pointed back to Fort. His charisma could no longer shield him. He had built his empire on loyalty, but now that same empire was testifying against him. As the trial unfolded, Fort's demeanor remained eerily composed. He prayed in his cell, spoke little, and occasionally smiled at the cameras as though he knew something no one else did. To those who had once followed him, his silence was powerful, to the prosecutors, it was arrogance. And when the verdict finally came, it shattered any illusions that remained. Jeff Fort was found guilty of conspiracy to commit terrorism on behalf of a foreign government, among other charges. The sentence was severe. Fort was condemned to 80 years in federal prison, effectively a life sentence. He was transferred to the most secure prison in the United States, the Administrative Maximum Facility in Florence, Colorado, known simply as Supermax. It was a place designed for the most dangerous, the most isolated, the most feared. The news rippled through Chicago like a cold wind. For many, it was the end of an era. The man who had once promised salvation to the South Side had become a cautionary tale of power corrupted by ego and delusion. Yet even as he was locked away, Fort's name carried weight. The Rukn still existed in fragments, its members scattered but not entirely erased. His legacy, dark and complex, refused to die. Behind the razor wire and steel doors of his new prison cell, Jeff Fort sat alone. The prophet, the general, the visionary, now just another inmate in a world built to erase identity. And yet, in his mind, the mission was not over. He whispered prayers into the silence, convinced that history would one day see him not as a criminal, but as a misunderstood leader who dared to dream of divine revolution. Outside, the city he once ruled kept moving, its streets alive with new names, new power struggles, new stories. But the echo of his rise and fall lingered like a ghost over the South Side, a reminder that even the most sacred visions can become their own undoing when faith turns into obsession. In the aftermath of Jeff Fort's conviction, the world outside his cell continued to transform, but within the cold concrete walls of the Supermax prison, time seemed to freeze. The silence was total, an endless void interrupted only by the sound of metal doors locking and the echo of footsteps down sterile corridors. For a man who once commanded hundreds and spoke to crowds that hung on every word, isolation was both a punishment and a revelation. Here, stripped of his empire and surrounded by nothing but concrete and solitude, Jeff Fort was forced to confront himself. Yet even in confinement, he refused to see himself as defeated. To the guards, he appeared calm, detached, even regal in demeanor. To him, this was not the end of his mission, but its spiritual continuation. Fort began to describe his imprisonment as a form of divine trial, a purification process that separated his mortal shell from his sacred purpose. He claimed that Allah had placed him there to meditate, to rise above earthly corruption, and to prepare for a new chapter of divine work. His followers outside, though fewer in number, still received occasional messages through coded letters and whispered communications. These messages often contained fragments of scripture, cryptic commands, and visions of renewal. Meanwhile, the remnants of Rukn struggled to survive in the streets of Chicago. The gang structure had been decimated by years of arrests, convictions, and internal betrayal. The old symbols, the red and black colors, the crescent moon and star, were still worn by some, but they had lost their original meaning. The disciplined, quasi-religious brotherhood Fort had tried to build had fragmented into smaller factions, many reverting to the same street-level violence and drug trade that he once sought to transcend. Without his commanding presence, chaos replaced order. The community that had once feared and revered Fort was now divided in its memory of him. To some elders on the South Side, he remained a visionary, a young man who had tried to bring dignity and structure to a generation abandoned by the system. They remembered how he had spoken about education, unity, and pride when no one else cared. But to others, especially those who had lost sons and brothers to gang violence, he was a tragic symbol of how power and ego could destroy everything good that began in hope. His story became a cautionary tale whispered in street corners and community meetings, a reminder that charisma without restraint could lead even the gifted to ruin. Inside prison, Fort's daily life followed a precise and suffocating rhythm. He was kept in near-total isolation for 23 hours a day, with only 1 hour for exercise in a small enclosed yard surrounded by concrete walls. He read voraciously, scriptures, history, and philosophy, and wrote constantly in notebooks that were often confiscated by guards for inspection. Fellow inmates, through the limited channels of communication available, referred to him as Chief Malik or simply the Prophet. Even behind bars, his aura of command persisted. He continued to shape narratives about himself, believing that history would vindicate his actions. In his mind, the government's case had never been about terrorism, it had been about silencing a powerful black leader who refused to submit. He saw himself in the lineage of Malcolm X and Marcus Garvey, revolutionaries who challenged oppressive systems and paid the price. But while those men inspired mass movements, Fort's path had spiraled into secrecy, violence, and spiritual fanaticism. His was a revolution that devoured itself from within. As years passed, the world moved on. The gang landscape in Chicago changed dramatically, new factions rose, drug empires shifted, and the name El Rukn became more legend than reality. Still, Fort's influence lingered like a shadow. Many of the modern gangs that dominated Chicago's South Side drew indirectly from his model: hierarchical structures, codes of loyalty, and a sense of identity rooted in more than just crime. Even in downfall, his methods had left an imprint on the city's underworld. Academics and historians began to take interest in his story. Books, documentaries, and university studies examined how a street gang had evolved into a quasi-religious organization, how faith and violence intertwined, and how charisma could reshape the social fabric of a community. To some scholars, Fort represented the extreme edge of urban resistance, a man who tried to elevate street power into a form of political and spiritual revolution. To others, he was simply a cautionary archetype of hubris, a leader consumed by the myth of his own divinity. Fort, now older and more introspective, began to understand the paradox of his legacy. In letters that reached beyond prison walls, he spoke of forgiveness and reflection. He admitted that mistakes had been made but insisted that his intentions had always been for the betterment of his people. "We were never about destruction," he wrote in one message that circulated among former members, "but about creation. It was the world that refused to understand our vision." In rare interviews granted through intermediaries, Fort described himself not as a criminal but as a misunderstood reformer, a man who had been punished for trying to bring order to chaos. Yet even in these statements, his tone carried the same mix of conviction and delusion that had defined him for decades. He could not separate his personal fall from the myth he had built around himself. As the 1990s and early 2000s unfolded, his name occasionally resurfaced in pop culture and hip-hop lyrics, invoked as both legend and warning. Younger generations who had never known him personally still recognized the name Jeff Fort as part of Chicago's mythology, a figure who blurred the lines between saint, soldier, and sinner. Some artists portrayed him as a martyr of systemic oppression, others as the embodiment of how absolute power corrupts absolutely. In his cell, Fort grew older. His beard grayed, his eyesight weakened, and his health declined. Yet his faith, by all accounts, remained unbroken. He continued to pray 5 times a day, fast during Ramadan, and study the Quran. Those who managed to communicate with him described a man who still believed that his life had divine purpose, that even his isolation served a greater plan. And perhaps, in a strange way, it did. Jeff Fort's transformation from street hustler to revolutionary prophet, from neighborhood leader to convicted terrorist, reflected the tragic complexity of a man who embodied both the promise and the peril of rebellion. His story revealed how easily vision could turn to madness when unchecked, how faith could be used to inspire or to control, and how the line between liberation and destruction often lies within a single human soul. In the end, Jeff Fort became a paradox that America could neither fully condemn nor fully understand. He was both product and rebel of the system that shaped him, a man who tried to transcend the streets that raised him and ended up imprisoned by the empire he built. His name, though faded, continues to haunt the history of Chicago, a reminder that power, once touched by faith and ambition, never truly disappears. It merely transforms, waiting to rise again in another form, in another time, through someone else who dares to dream as dangerously as he once did. The years stretched on, and the weight of time settled heavily over Jeff Fort's world. By the time the late 1990s arrived, he had become more myth than man, an almost ghostly figure within America's penal system. Locked deep within the confines of the Florence ADX Supermax prison, he was cut off from all contact except for the rare letter or monitored visit. The silence, however, did not erase his presence. If anything, it made it grow, turning him into a legend whispered through generations who never met him but still felt his name vibrate through the streets of Chicago's South Side. Outside those walls, the remnants of his legacy took on strange and evolving forms. The Rukn name had faded, replaced by the newer faces of Chicago's gang landscape, the Black Disciples, the Gangster Disciples, the Vice Lords, and countless smaller offshoots. Yet the structure, the idea of transforming gangs into organized hierarchies with codes, symbols, and internal order, could still be traced back to Fort's model. It was as though his blueprint had been absorbed into the DNA of Chicago's underworld. Even those who didn't follow his teachings directly inherited his vision in fragments. The idea that a gang could be more than just crime, that it could be an institution of identity, power, and even politics, was one that Jeff Fort had introduced long before the rest of the nation caught on. This concept echoed in prison yards, in community meetings, and in songs that chronicled the struggle of life in America's forgotten neighborhoods. For historians and sociologists studying urban America, Fort's story became a prism through which they examined questions of power, race, and control. His life embodied both the potential for transformation and the inevitability of corruption when charisma met unrestrained influence. Scholars debated whether his movement could have succeeded had it remained separate from drugs and violence. Some argued that Fort's downfall was inevitable, that the environment he operated in, the systemic neglect, the economic despair, and the political suspicion toward black activism made true reform impossible. Others believed his transformation into Chief Malik had doomed him, turning a social leader into a cult figure trapped by his own mythology. Meanwhile, Fort's name lived on in the music that emerged from the streets he once ruled. Chicago rappers invoked his legacy, sometimes as a badge of respect, other times as a symbol of caution. In the cadences of drill and the reflective verses of conscious hip-hop, you could hear echoes of his reign, a story of a man who tried to turn rebellion into order, and ended up consumed by both. For a generation that grew up amid systemic inequality, Fort's tale felt hauntingly familiar, a dream that began with unity and ended in exile. From his cell, Fort occasionally caught glimpses of these shifting cultural tides. Through news clippings, letters from old allies, or filtered reports from lawyers, he learned how the world had reshaped his story. He saw himself described as a prophet, a criminal mastermind, a revolutionary, and a cautionary tale, all at once. He realized that he had become a symbol to many people he would never meet. In his writings, he sometimes hinted that perhaps that was always his destiny, not to be understood in his lifetime, but to be interpreted afterward. In the isolation of the supermax, days and nights melted together. There was no skyline, no wind from Lake Michigan, no hum of the city that had once defined him. Only silence, and in that silence, Fort's mind often traveled back to the days of his youth. He remembered the smell of asphalt after rain, the sound of basketballs echoing in housing projects, the nervous laughter of boys planning their first hustle. He remembered when leadership felt like destiny, not burden. When his name inspired hope before it became synonymous with fear. He began to see his own life as a series of transformations, each one both an evolution and a trap. The young hustler became a leader, the leader became a prophet, the prophet became a prisoner. And in each stage, he had believed he was doing what was right, even when his actions betrayed that belief. He wrote about this duality in several letters, some of which later found their way into academic archives and documentaries. A man can build and destroy with the same hand, one line read. The difference lies not in what he does, but in what he believes he's doing. His reflections carried a quiet weight, a man coming to terms with the contradictions that had defined his existence. There was no self-pity in his words, only a kind of spiritual weariness. He acknowledged the lives lost under his command, the communities scarred by his decisions, and the people who had followed him into ruin. Yet he also reminded readers that his original purpose had been noble, to give direction to a generation that the world had abandoned. That tension between vision and destruction would become the heart of his enduring myth. As time passed, even law enforcement began to look at Jeff Fort's legacy through a more analytical lens. Federal agents who had once viewed him as a public enemy now spoke about him with a strange mix of respect and caution. He had been, after all, one of the first figures in American history to merge street power, religion, and politics into a single entity. His attempt to reinvent gang culture as a revolutionary movement foreshadowed future hybrid forms of activism and militancy that would appear across the world. In neighborhoods once controlled by the Black P. Stones and later the L. Rukns, murals occasionally appeared, faded paintings of crescent moons, fists raised in unity, or portraits of a man in dark sunglasses and a kufi. The elders who remembered Fort sometimes spoke of him with quiet nostalgia, while the young often didn't know his name at all. Time had turned him into both a ghost and a monument, present in the culture's bones but invisible in daily life. Within prison, Fort's health continued to decline. His movements slowed, his hands shook when he wrote, and the sharpness that once defined his voice softened into contemplation. Yet, according to reports from those who managed to speak to him, his faith never wavered. He still referred to himself as a servant of Allah, still believed in redemption, and still saw meaning in the life that had unfolded, no matter how tragic. He often compared his life to that of the phoenix, a creature that must burn to be reborn. He told one visitor, "They buried the man, but they cannot bury the message." It was a statement that carried both conviction and tragedy. For Fort, his message had long since outgrown his control. The world had taken it, reshaped it, and transformed it into something else entirely. By the early 2000s, Fort's influence had become historical, woven into the city's folklore, studied in universities, and whispered about by those who once followed him. He was no longer the fiery leader giving speeches on Chicago streets, nor the feared revolutionary commanding a private army. He had become something more ambiguous, a symbol of both aspiration and downfall, of what happens when the pursuit of power and righteousness collide in one man's soul. And so, as he grew older behind those walls, Jeff Fort began to fade into the quiet rhythm of time. His life had become a story told by others, a legend with no single author. To some, he would always be the man who tried to lift his people from poverty and oppression. To others, he would remain the figure who led them into darkness. But for Fort himself, perhaps the truth rested somewhere in between, somewhere in the long silence of his cell, where the echoes of his past still whispered in the dark, asking whether the revolution he dreamed of had ever truly died, or whether it was still waiting to awaken once more. By the mid-2000s, Jeff Fort had spent decades behind bars, decades that transformed him from a living figure of command into a relic of a turbulent era. The city that once echoed his name had changed beyond recognition. Skyscrapers rose over neighborhoods that had once been battlegrounds. Gentrification crept through the South Side, pushing families out of the very streets where Fort's movement had begun. The crack epidemic that had consumed the 1980s had faded, replaced by new social struggles, mass incarceration, gang fragmentation, and digital age warfare. Yet, despite all the change, the myth of Jeff Fort still lived on quietly, a story half remembered, half feared, and never fully understood. Inside his concrete cell at ADX Florence, Fort lived in an endless routine that blurred the difference between night and day. The lights came on at 6 in the morning, but the world outside his narrow slit of a window felt frozen in perpetual twilight. Meals were delivered through a slot in the steel door. Conversation was almost non-existent, and every sound, a key turning, a footstep echoing, carried the weight of meaning. His solitude was nearly total, yet his mind remained busy. Even with failing eyesight and an aging body, Fort continued to write. Pages filled with flowing script, part prayer, part manifesto, part reflection, collected in folders that would occasionally be confiscated, studied, or lost. His writings revealed a man caught between faith and regret. In one passage, he described his imprisonment as a divine test, a challenge meant to separate his human flaws from his spiritual mission. In another, he acknowledged that power, once attained, becomes an illusion that controls its holder. Man believes he rules, one line read, but it is the idea that rules him. He seemed to understand, finally, how his attempt to merge spiritual authority with earthly control had led to ruin. Still, he maintained that his original purpose, uplifting his people, had never been corrupted in his heart. We wanted light, he wrote. But light burns those who stare too long. Outside prison walls, the academic world continued to revisit his story. Professors in sociology, criminology, and African American studies dissected the paradox of the Black Pete, Stone Rangers and their evolution into the Rukns. Documentaries revisited his speeches, analyzing his transformation from street boss to self-styled revolutionary. Some commentators viewed him as a forerunner to modern social movements, a man who attempted to organize disenfranchised black youth into a disciplined force for change, only to be crushed by state power and internal contradictions. Others saw him as the embodiment of wasted potential, a brilliant mind lost to pride and paranoia. Meanwhile, former members of his organization aged like him, some finding redemption, others lost to time. A few spoke publicly, giving interviews about the early days, the sense of unity and purpose that once surrounded Fort. They described him as a man who could electrify a room with a single look, who made young men feel like soldiers in a sacred cause. Yet, when asked if they forgave him for what became of them, their faces carried hesitation. He believed, one former lieutenant said in a documentary, but belief ain't enough when you lead people into fire. The younger generation of Chicago barely knew his name, but they inherited his world, the systems of power, the symbols, the fractured legacy of organized street culture. His influence lingered like an invisible map drawn beneath the surface of modern gangs. They still used codes, hand signs, colors, and hierarchies, echoes of the structure he had once designed. But without the ideology that once framed those symbols, they had become hollow markers of survival rather than unity. Even the city itself seemed haunted by his absence. Some elders on the South Side spoke of him with a strange mix of reverence and melancholy. They remembered how, in the 1960s, he had demanded respect from politicians and forced Chicago's institutions to acknowledge the forgotten youth of the projects. They recalled the marches, the community centers, the days when the Black Pete Stones were more like an army of order than a mob of chaos. But they also remembered the violence, the fear, and the feeling that something pure had been lost when ambition turned inward. Fort had represented both the hope and the tragedy of their generation, a young man who tried to rewrite destiny with his own hands. In prison, Fort's health continued to deteriorate. He suffered from hypertension, vision loss, and long-term effects of isolation. His once strong voice had softened into a whisper, but those who managed to speak with him described his tone as calm, patient, and deeply reflective. He spent much of his time praying, sometimes reciting the Quran aloud in the dark. There was a sense that he had finally accepted his fate, not as punishment, but as atonement. And yet, even in his frailty, he remained enigmatic. There were moments when his old conviction flared to life. In one recorded message, he said, "They can cage the body, but not the idea. The idea will move through generations like air, unseen, but necessary." It was the same blend of defiance and mysticism that had once inspired entire neighborhoods. Those words, passed around among former Rukns and quoted online by admirers, became something like his final doctrine, a declaration that revolutions might die, but their echoes endure. Occasionally, journalists attempted to reach him for interviews, but he rarely responded. When he did, his answers were cryptic and brief, laced with metaphor. He spoke less about crime and politics, and more about divine will, purpose, and redemption. His thoughts had shifted inward, toward spirituality, as though he were preparing himself for a final transformation, one that would free him from both the prison and the persona he had carried for so long. In the years that followed, Fort's family continued to advocate for his release, citing his declining health and the decades he had already served. Legal appeals were filed, petitions were signed, but the system remained unmoved. The government still considered him a high-risk inmate, a man too influential to ever walk free again. His name remained on the list of those confined under special administrative measures, ensuring that his communication with the outside world stayed severely limited. As time passed, the once feared revolutionary became a quiet figure of contemplation. He was no longer the chief or prophet his followers had worshipped, but simply an aging man, reflecting on the life that had both elevated and destroyed him. Perhaps that was his final lesson, the realization that even the most powerful revolutions must face the truth of impermanence. That fire, no matter how bright, eventually cools into ash. And yet, in that cooling, there is something eternal. The story of Jeff Fort, the gang leader who tried to become a revolutionary, became more than just history. It became a meditation on human nature, on the fragile line between vision and delusion, on how even the most chaotic lives can carry a strange kind of beauty when viewed through the long lens of time. Somewhere, perhaps in the quietest moments of night, Fort might have understood this. As the hum of prison lights filled his cell, and the world outside continued to change, he may have realized that his legacy was no longer his to control. It had become a living myth, a story passed from one generation to the next, retold in whispers, reshaped by memory. A tale not just about power, but about the longing to matter. About one man's attempt to lift himself and his people from the shadows, and the price that came with trying to change the world from the edge of darkness. As the 2010s unfolded, Jeff Fort's name belonged more to history than to the streets. The city of Chicago had changed beyond anything he might have recognized. Technology ruled everything: cell phones, social media, instant fame. The gangs that once moved with military precision under leaders like him now operated in scattered cells, guided not by ideology but by impulse. The world he had built through sheer willpower had dissolved into the noise of a new generation. Yet, within that noise, traces of his influence still pulsed faintly, like a heartbeat beneath concrete. In the housing projects where the Blackstone Rangers had once marched in formation, new generations spoke his name like a rumor. Some had only heard fragments, stories passed down by uncles, old-timers, or grandmothers who remembered when Jeff Fort was more than just a gangster. To them, he was a mythic figure, part hero, part ghost. They knew he had done something big, something that had changed the city, though few understood what exactly it was. In the collective imagination of Chicago's South Side, Jeff Fort had become a symbol of something rare, a man who had dared to take control when the world refused to give him any. Meanwhile, the academic and media interest in Fort's life deepened. Documentaries revisiting America's gang culture often included a chapter on him. Professors used his transformation from gang leader to self-proclaimed revolutionary as a case study in leadership psychology, urban sociology, and the politics of control. They debated whether his alliance with the Nation of Islam and later his conversion to Islam had been acts of spiritual awakening or strategic rebranding. His trial for terrorism, the first of its kind against a U.S. street gang, remained a landmark moment in American criminal justice history. But for all the analysis and discussion, Jeff Fort himself remained a mystery, locked away in near-total isolation, his body aging, his world shrinking. Those few who managed to correspond with him described a man of serenity, deeply immersed in faith and reflection. They said he had accepted his place in history and viewed his imprisonment as part of a divine pattern. "The Almighty gives each man his post," he wrote in one letter. "Mine was to lead, to fall, to understand." Fort's spiritual writings from this period took on a tone of reconciliation. They spoke not of revolution or power, but of forgiveness, mercy, and the search for peace within confinement. "The true battle," he wrote, "is not between men, but within the soul that craves freedom." His words, though rarely seen by the public, resonated with those who had known him in his younger years. Some former Rukns, now in their 60s and 70s, began to revisit their past through his reflections. They spoke about their own regrets, their lost friends, and the strange, tragic beauty of having believed in something bigger than themselves. In those conversations, Fort's name was often uttered with a kind of reluctant respect. They remembered his discipline, his charisma, his ability to make the impossible seem attainable. "He made us believe we were more than street kids," one former lieutenant said in an interview. "He made us believe we could change the world. Maybe we didn't, but for a minute, it felt real." Outside, Chicago's violence continued to evolve. Shootings erupted not for territory or ideology but for pride, retaliation, or fleeting fame. Community leaders lamented that the structure and discipline Fort once imposed had given way to chaos. It was an irony that many could not ignore. the man once vilified for organizing gangs had, in hindsight, represented a form of control and stability that the modern streets lacked. Reporters occasionally revisited his story, publishing retrospectives titled The Rise and Fall of Jeff Fort or The Gangster Who Tried to Be a Prophet. Each retelling added a new layer of interpretation, painting him as both villain and visionary. To some, he symbolized the dangerous allure of power; to others, he was a man crushed by the weight of systemic oppression and his own ambition. The duality of his life, ruler and prisoner, prophet and criminal, made him an endlessly fascinating figure. Inside his cell, Fort was aware of how he was being remembered. In his few communications, he often alluded to the concept of legacy. "History writes what men cannot say," he wrote in one letter. "If they remember me, let them remember I tried." His tone suggested neither regret nor pride, just acceptance. He seemed to understand that his story had outgrown his control, that it now belonged to the collective imagination. In his solitude, Fort's faith remained his constant companion. Every day, he performed his prayers with precision, bowing in the same direction, whispering the same words he had spoken for decades. The rhythm of prayer gave structure to his time, a kind of order that mirrored the discipline he had once demanded of his men. Those who studied his later years described him as almost monastic, living a life stripped of material distractions, consumed by contemplation. Occasionally, he received letters from young men who still looked up to him. They wrote about their struggles, about how the system had failed them, about how they wanted to rise as he once did. In his replies, Fort no longer preached rebellion. Instead, he urged patience, education, and faith. "The enemy is not the police or the government," he wrote in one letter. "The enemy is ignorance. Conquer that, and you have already won." Those words revealed a man who had come full circle, from a defiant youth waging war against authority to an elder seeking inner peace. It was a quiet evolution, almost invisible to the world outside, but profound in its symbolism. The man who once commanded armies of followers now led only himself, through faith, through reflection, through the vast silence of time. Yet even as Fort mellowed, the mythology surrounding him grew wilder. On social media, his name appeared in rap lyrics, podcasts, and YouTube videos exploring Chicago's history. Some portrayed him as a revolutionary betrayed by the system, others painted him as a cautionary tale of how power corrupts. The truth, as always, lived somewhere in between. In 2015, a journalist described him as a man whose influence transcended both morality and mortality. That description captured the essence of Jeff Fort's life, his ability to exist in contradiction, to be revered and reviled, remembered and forgotten, all at once. His story wasn't just about crime or religion, it was about transformation. The way one man's search for control over chaos mirrored the city's struggle to control itself. By the late 2010s, Fort's health had deteriorated significantly. Reports suggested he could no longer see well, that he moved slowly, that his once firm voice had weakened. And yet, when he spoke of his faith, those who heard him said his words carried the same fire they always had. "The body fades," he said once, "but truth remains light." It was perhaps the final stage of his long transformation, from street legend to philosopher in confinement. In that solitude, stripped of all followers and power, Jeff Fort seemed to find a peace that had eluded him his entire life. His story had begun in the chaos of Chicago's streets and ended in the quiet of a concrete cell. But even there, in that stillness, the echoes of his life continued to ripple outward. In the end, Jeff Fort's legacy became something larger than one man's life. It became a mirror held up to America itself, to its streets, its systems, its failures, and its dreams. His journey, with all its contradictions, revealed a hard truth, that greatness and ruin often share the same road, and that even the darkest paths can leave behind lessons for those who dare to look closely. The years that followed Jeff Fort's imprisonment were not just years of confinement, they were years of transformation. For a man who had once commanded the streets of Chicago with unshakable authority, the silence of a maximum security cell was a world entirely foreign. Gone were the crowds, the followers, the coded messages, and the sharp rhythm of street politics. In their place came stillness, an endless cycle of introspection that stripped him down to his most vulnerable self. Fort's transfer to the federal supermax facility marked the final phase of his life's paradox. Inside those concrete walls, surrounded by the country's most dangerous inmates, he lived in almost total isolation. 23 hours a day in a cell no larger than a bathroom. A single hour for exercise, alone, under the watchful eye of guards who never spoke unless necessary. In that cold silence, Fort began to face the echo of everything he had done. At first, he resisted reflection. He viewed his imprisonment as injustice, a political act meant to silence a man who dared to speak truth from the streets. He compared his fate to that of revolutionaries, Malcolm X, Marcus Garvey, and others who had been misunderstood in their time. To him, the government's charges of terrorism were never about crime, they were about containment, keeping black leadership from evolving into power. But as the years stretched on and his body aged, even Fort's certainty began to tremble. The scriptures he read every morning started to take on a different meaning. Words about humility, repentance, and inner peace no longer felt abstract, they felt personal. He began writing again, letters filled with fragments of wisdom, reflections on faith, and occasional regrets. Some letters went to family, others to former followers who still considered him a spiritual guide. But even those who once worshipped him could feel the change. Gone was the commanding Chief Malik, who spoke like a general. In his place was a man humbled by time, whose tone carried softness rather than command. For many of his followers, those letters became sacred texts. They read them aloud in small gatherings, interpreting his words as lessons from a spiritual master. Yet, for Fort himself, the writings were not sermons, they were confessions. He spoke of pride, of the burden of power, of the danger in believing oneself chosen. A man who thinks he leads without serving, he once wrote, is only walking in circles. Those words, quietly penned in a federal cell, reflected the clarity that only solitude could bring. Outside prison walls, the world that had once revolved around him continued to change. The streets of Chicago were no longer the same battlegrounds he had once ruled. The younger generation barely recognized his name, and those who did saw it more as myth than memory. The discipline of the old Rukn days had faded into fragmentation. Rival gangs rose and fell, each adopting traces of his organizational model but none of his unifying purpose. His once sacred symbols, the crescent moon, the red and black, became diluted, stripped of their meaning as faith gave way to survival. Even so, Fort's influence remained invisible yet persistent. His blueprint for structure, the idea that a street organization could be more than chaos, became a model for many who came after. They might not have known the source, but the echoes of his methods, hierarchies, codes, unity, lived on. Scholars and sociologists later observed that Fort had unintentionally shaped the modern structure of urban gangs, creating systems that mimicked governments, with ranks, territories, and unwritten laws. What he had built to bring order had, in his absence, become an enduring paradox, an order built from disorder. Inside his solitary world, Fort found fragments of peace in faith. The Quran became his closest companion. He fasted during Ramadan, prayed 5 times daily, and spent nights in meditation. Religion, once a political tool, became personal redemption. He no longer spoke of divine missions or prophecies. Instead, he spoke of patience, forgiveness, and submission. Those who visited him in later years described him as calm, introspective, and almost serene. The fire that had once driven him to rule had cooled into quiet acceptance. Still, there were moments of haunting reflection. Some nights, Fort reportedly spoke softly to himself, repeating names from the past, friends lost, enemies betrayed, dreams unfulfilled. He would pause, then whisper prayers, as if releasing each name into the air for forgiveness. In those moments, the weight of his choices pressed upon him, not as guilt, but as realization. He had tried to change the world through force, but learned too late that transformation could not be built on control. There is a certain poetry in how power returns to silence. The man who once stood before crowds and commanded entire communities now found meaning in solitude. What he once called punishment had become his teacher. He learned patience through stillness, wisdom through loss, and humility through the quiet acceptance of fate. As years passed, Fort's health began to decline. The outside world forgot him, but he never seemed to forget the world. He remained aware of events, wars, social changes, the evolution of his city, and in every headline, he found lessons. He once told a visitor, "The streets move like rivers, they change course, but the water never disappears." It was a metaphor for his own life, his influence unseen yet still flowing through the currents of history. By the end of that decade, Jeff Fort had become a man at peace with contradiction. To the system, he was a prisoner serving life without parole. To scholars, a figure of historical complexity. To a few who still remembered him, he was both prophet and cautionary tale. But to himself, perhaps for the first time, he was simply human, a soul stripped of illusion, reconciled with its past, waiting for whatever peace eternity might offer. In that silence, somewhere between repentance and remembrance, Jeff Fort found what he had spent his life searching for, not dominance, not recognition, but understanding. And in that understanding, his long, turbulent journey came full circle. Jeff Fort's years in isolation turned time into something abstract, a slow, endless cycle of prayer, memory, and silence. Inside his small cell, he began to see life not as a series of victories and defeats, but as a single, unbroken lesson. The man who once ruled entire neighborhoods now lived with only his thoughts, tracing the rise and fall of his empire through the shadows of his mind. Letters occasionally reached him, some from loyal followers, others from scholars, and sometimes from old friends seeking closure. Each one reminded him of the world he had left behind. Some wrote of admiration, others of pain. A few simply asked him, was it worth it? Fort rarely answered directly. Instead, he wrote about faith, destiny, and the unseen hand of God. His words no longer carried orders, but reflections, soft, uncertain, almost human. Over time, his anger faded, replaced by something deeper, understanding. He realized that control had been his greatest illusion. The empire he built, the brotherhood he tried to sanctify, even the power he believed divine, all were fleeting. Yet within that realization came a strange peace. He began to see his journey as part of a larger story, one that extended beyond him, beyond Chicago, beyond even the idea of crime or redemption. To those who still whispered his name, he had become a myth. To himself, he was simply a man who had walked too far into the storm. And as the days blended into nights within the silent corridors of the prison, Jeff Fort finally began to accept the truth he had spent a lifetime avoiding, that sometimes, the greatest act of power is learning how to let go. Years behind bars changed Jeff Fort in ways no outside power ever could. Gone was the fiery commander of armies, replaced by a quiet, meditative figure who spoke less but thought more. Each day began before dawn with prayer, and ended in the stillness of reflection. The walls of his cell became both his punishment and his sanctuary, a space where the echoes of his past grew softer with time. From his isolation, Fort watched the world evolve through headlines and whispers. The gangs he once led had splintered, the city had changed, and younger generations barely knew his name. Yet, in certain corners of Chicago, his legend lived on in faint traces, symbols on walls, stories told in hushed tones. To some, he remained the visionary who tried to give structure to chaos. To others, he was the warning of what happens when ambition grows unchecked. In those final years, Fort began writing again, short letters filled with reflection, faith, and fragments of regret. He wrote not to justify himself, but to leave behind understanding. The hardest battle, he once wrote, is the one inside your own soul. Behind the iron doors, he was no longer the feared Chief Malik but simply a man seeking peace in the silence he could no longer escape. Outside his prison walls, the world had almost forgotten Jeff Fort. Yet the echoes of his leadership remained embedded in the DNA of Chicago's streets. The organization he built, though fractured, influenced the way later gangs structured themselves, hierarchies, rituals, and a sense of belonging that mirrored his early vision. His methods, once radical, became blueprints for generations who never knew his face. Meanwhile, academics, journalists, and artists revisited his story as a window into America's social decay and resilience. Fort became more than a man, he became a symbol, a case study in how charisma, faith, and power could both uplift and destroy. His name carried weight in university lectures, documentaries, and even rap lyrics that sought to capture the paradox of his legacy. To those who once knew him, Jeff Fort was not a ghost but a lesson. He proved that power can be created from nothing, and that the same power, once corrupted, can destroy everything it builds. His empire had vanished, but the questions he raised about justice, poverty, and redemption continued to echo through generations. As the years slipped away, Jeff Fort's story transformed into legend, half truth, half myth, forever suspended between glory and tragedy. In the end, he found himself not as a ruler, but as a man humbled by time. His journey from the crowded streets of Woodlawn to the isolation of a federal cell revealed the full arc of human ambition, how dreams of power can both define and destroy a life. Fort's name remains carved into Chicago's memory, not for his crimes alone, but for the vision he once held, that even in broken places, strength could rise. His fall reminds us that leadership without restraint turns hope into tyranny, and that redemption often comes too late to save the dreamer. In the quiet of his final years, Fort turned inward, seeking the peace that eluded him in youth. His life became a mirror for all who followed, a reflection of how greatness and downfall are often born from the same fire. When his story is told now, it is less about a gangster, and more about a man who tried to fight the darkness around him, only to become part of it. And somewhere, in that haunting truth, lies the reason his story endures, a whispered reminder that every empire, no matter how powerful, eventually fades into silence.